The stones of the ancient world still speak, revealing the people, places, and events that illuminate the world of the Bible. Join archaeologist Dr. George Sparks and Dr. David E. Graves as they explore biblical discoveries that bring Scripture's historical setting to life. Sponsored by Electronic Christian Media. Now let's dig into today's podcast and discover the past.
Good day, everybody. This is a new archaeological podcast, Stones That Speak, with Dr. David Graves, and I am Dr. George Sparks. We have a very special guest. His name is Dr. Richard Gallagher, board-certified psychiatrist, a professor of psychiatry at New York Medical, a psychoanalyst on the faculty of Columbia University. He has graduated from Princeton University, Phi Beta Kappa in classics, and trained as a resident in psychiatry at Yale University School of Medicine. He is one of the world's foremost scientific experts on the subject of demonic attack. He has been an active member of the International Association of Exorcists since 1990s. He was gracious to accept our invitation today, and we're going to try our best to unpack his best-selling book, Demonic Foes. Doctor, thank you for being on our program.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you for the introduction.
Yes, sir. You know, this is an interesting topic, and it's a serious topic, and I'd like to just jump right into it, if you will.
Of course.
So first, a little bit of a history introduction of yourself, that you're a licensed medical professional in psychiatry. How did you become involved with exorcisms?
Well, what I usually tell people, Mr. Sparks, is I never volunteered. And I don't think it's a good idea necessarily for anyone because, you know, they're more than just doctors like myself involved sometimes in this broader field of deliverance and exorcisms and all that. I'm not always sure that it is a great idea for people to volunteer, you know. You have to have a reasonable spiritual life, in my opinion. You have to have people praying for me, which I do. The long story is, you know, I had finished my residency in psychiatry at Yale, and I was aware at the time, I don't know if you've heard the term, you or your audience have heard the term, the satanic panic.
Yes.
This was a time, mostly in the 80s, early 90s, where people were seeing Satan all over the place. And they were exaggerating the amount of Satanists in the country. They were exaggerating the amount of kids that were kidnapped and all that. I mean, in some ways, that has not entirely died down, but it is widely recognized, you know, among Christian community, including myself, that some of that was exaggerated. And I heard stories like that when I was in training at Yale. So then I took a job at the time at Cornell Medical College. I was an attending psychiatrist. I was an academic. You know, I had been trained in a fairly mainstream way, and I still regard myself as, you know, a mainstream psychiatrist. I believe in the science of the field of psychiatry and medicine. So I think as a scientist about, you know, my professional life. But on the other hand, you know, I was brought up Christian, I was brought up Catholic, and, you know, I sort of always had some feeling like there definitely was some truth to the whole world of the demonic. I mean, you know, even in the Gospels, obviously, you know, Jesus delivers people. I was not skeptical that, you know, Jesus was dealing with real cases of possession and that sort of thing. Just from my experience as a clinician at Yale, I didn't really think I would see those cases. And I also didn't think that, I did think that there was, you know, a certain amount of exaggeration. So that's the introduction to how I got involved. I got involved because there was a very famous Catholic priest, exorcist, who, you know, I guess he heard that I was a Christian and a psychiatrist. And he actually knocked on my door one day at an office at New York Hospital, Cornell, as it was called at the time. And he introduced himself, and he was a very pleasant, educated guy. And he said, Dr. Gallagher, from time to time, we in the church, we see cases that we suspect have a demonic component. But, we like to have medical input too. We like to have a physician evaluate these cases before we're sure and before we give them the spiritual assistance that we know they need. So I said to him, well, Father, with all due respect, and I do respect clergy, I said, during my training, I heard a lot of bogus cases. I heard a lot of people who were delusional or, had what was being called at the time multiple personality and dissociative identity disorder. Some people are just very suggestible. So I said, I think a number of those cases, at least the ones that I've encountered, are bogus. They don't have true demonic attacks. And I remember very well, he smiled a little bit and he said, well, Dr. Gallagher, I see that you're a little skeptical of some of this field. And then he said to me, well, you're the perfect man for the job, because he and his colleagues, and there weren't very many Catholic exorcists at the time. There were many more people in the Protestant community who were doing deliverance or, types of exorcisms, whether they called that or not. So the Catholic Church in America, had not trained very many exorcists. And so he was able in subsequent years, I agreed to see these cases. Some of them at that point knocked my socks off. They were truly amazing. And since he was one of the few exorcists in America, he and a colleague of his from New England, they both sent me a lot of cases, and sometimes I would even travel with them to see cases elsewhere. So very quickly, I developed a tremendous amount of experience. And, I won't exactly say, I found it interesting, obviously, but I wouldn't exactly say I was, ambitious to get involved in this field. But then over the years, I got asked to join the International Association as a scientific advisor. I got asked to write a book. I got asked to do lectures. And, I'm a physician. So if I see somebody who's suffering, I'm not going to back down just because, they present with a controversial condition that other physicians may either shy away from or think is nonsense. So that's the long answer to your question.
Okay, thank you very much. The second question would be, what was it like the first time you came across a case of diabolical attack, and how did it affect you?
Well, as I said, I know nobody should be involved in this field unless, they are, serious in their spiritual life. So I wasn't freaked out by what I saw, but of course it affected me. If anything, eventually I think it, deepened my faith in the Gospels and deepened my faith in the power of Jesus Christ. The first case I saw was not technically called a possession. There are different degrees of a demonic attack. And this woman who was a good Christian, she got attacked, I believe. Sometimes it's hard to discern it completely, but she felt that she was probably cursed by someone, in part because she was a good Christian. And, good Christians are somewhat protected, as St. Paul said, from demonic attacks, but not entirely. Demons can affect everybody to an extent. They usually can't possess people if they're a good Christian. So she had very unusual symptoms. I won't go into every single one, but the main thing she had is, and this is in front of her husband, this is in front of friends of hers. She would be in her house, maybe lying down or sitting in a chair, and all of a sudden she would feel like she was being attacked, literally attacked, in fact, literally beaten up by invisible spirits. And nobody could see these spirits, but they reported to me, because I interviewed other people besides herself, they reported to me that they would suddenly see bruises occurring on her body and her in great pain. So that's eventually why she appealed to the priest for spiritual help. And this priest who had introduced me to the field said, why don't you come to be evaluated by Dr. Gallagher, because you have some physical bruises. We want to make sure this is not some kind of bleeding disorder, or somebody's beating you up and you don't want to tell people or something. So I interviewed a number of people, including the husband, who was a very wonderful guy. And I did some lab tests, and we did some x-rays. And, my job is mainly to tell the clergy, look, there's no medical or psychiatric explanation. This is a perfectly coherent, sane, mentally healthy person. Nothing explains this case from I would use the word naturalistic or, normal scientific point of view. And he said to me, yes, Dr. Gallagher, this is what we and my colleagues believe. We believe she was suffering from an oppression, not a possession. The demon was not able to gain access to her body and her consciousness, but the demon could attack her from the outside. So long story short, he took my discernment seriously. He and another priest did a lot of spiritual prayers over this woman. She intensified her own spiritual life, and after about 6 months, these attacks stopped, and it was believed that she was, fully delivered.
You kind of answered this third question I'm going to ask. How is somebody diagnosed, and how do you not misdiagnose? Now, in your profession, you mentioned blood work and you mentioned x-rays, but also there's some psychiatry that must go into this as well.
Yeah, I mean, throughout history, especially in the Christian church, often it's kind of a misnomer. Often doctors have been asked, especially on the trickier cases. I mean, sometimes it's very obvious to the clergy, but and to the church, and to the different churches, not just the Catholic churches. And sometimes people, were misdiagnosed as epileptic or something like that, or they were epileptic and they were misdiagnosed as, demonically attacked. So you have to do, and the church, my church certainly has learned over the centuries, it pays to be a little cautious. And, to be diagnosed as oppressed or possessed, it does often pay to have, a doctor evaluate them. Often a psychiatrist is chosen, like myself. I mean, I was trained in internal medicine too, but a psychiatrist is chosen because a lot of the cases in the modern era seem to be the ones that are confusing, seem to be psychiatric patients who are delusional or something, and they only think they are attacked. For instance, people can hallucinate and believe that they're attacked by all kinds of things, the FBI or communists or sometimes evil spirits. So you have to make, complicated discernments. You have to make sure someone is not just suffering from schizophrenia, or someone is not so suggestible that they themselves or someone has convinced them that they have a demonic attack, when it's more of a psychological problem. So that's what we do. There are different criteria. With a possession, you often, some of the classic criteria, you may see the person go into a trance and speak foreign languages. You may see them having what is called in Latin letra, which means occult knowledge. They somehow know things that they would never know in their natural state. During a deliverance prayers or when they're in a trance state, they may exhibit all kinds of movements, or even, immense strength. And again, if they're possessed while in these trances and certain other states, they will exhibit tremendous either fear or hostility to anything sacred. For instance, they'll have a reaction to, crosses or crucifixes. They'll have a reaction to holy water. So every case, and what makes this field tricky, is every case is a little bit different. So you don't always see some or all of these more dramatic signs, but you see bizarre stuff that to a doctor cannot be explained by naturalistic science. And then, the priest may do, testing. Sometimes they test with, in the Catholic Church, with the Eucharist. Sometimes they test with holy objects or holy water. And you take all that information together and, you make a pretty rigorous diagnosis. I don't think, at least the way I've seen the Catholics do it, I don't think they are dealing with many misdiagnoses. By the time they offer the spiritual help and prayers, they're usually pretty clear this is something beyond just a medical or psychiatric illness. Now, again, I say you have to take the whole picture. So another thing that I do, and the priests do it as well, is you take a good history of what led to this possible condition. For instance, with the most serious attacks, which are possession, although they're not as common as attacks called oppression, which are kind of more minor level of demonic attack short of a possession, you will often see that there is a reason that the person became possessed. For instance, they may have turned to occultism, so they may have turned to even Satanism. When I told the priest I was skeptical of certain stories about Satanists, I didn't mean to imply that there were no Satanists. I have met Satanists, trust me. And they're often nasty people. They often try to keep themselves secret. That's why there's still controversy about this. But they're not lurking around every neighborhood, but they're out there. Much less than the satanic panic thought, but it not non-existent. So if someone turns to Satanism and then changes their mind, or if someone turns to serious occultism, including spiritualism, trying to channel spirits like through a seance or a Ouija board or something, these people can open themselves up. A number of these people, as Christians, we don't judge people, but a number of these people have also done some evil or at least very sinful things in their life. They may have been away from the church, and evil spirits are perfectly happy not to overtly attack them. But it's sometimes when they realize the error of their way, or just get so attacked that they say, I got to get the help of the church. Under those circumstances, the evil spirits may actually step up and attack because the evil spirit is mad that, they're turning to Christ, because that's the worst thing from their point of view. They not only fear Christ, but then they feel like this person had turned to us. They owe us obligations to stay with us because we've helped them in some way. Perversely, they think they've offered something. So they may offer some kind of favors in their life, which turn out to be, to use the phrase, quite a Faustian bargain. And people who are more perceptive begin to realize, my turning to the occult, even if it's not overt Satanism, or my turning to evil in my way has a price, and now I need, God's help, not only to, become a good Christian, but also to get rid of this problem I have.
Thank you. In your practice, have you ever had a case where somebody comes to your office for treatment, oppression or depression, and in the treatment, without a priest being involved, without a priest bringing them to you, they just come in feeling oppressed or depressed, but you might think there might be a demonic influence?
Well, it's a good question with a very complicated answer. First of all, these are not patients of mine.
Okay.
People with demonic attacks are sent to me usually by someone else. Or in today's world, since, I wrote the book Demonic Foes, and, I haven't been shy about speaking out publicly if people ask me. People sometimes do find me on themselves. And they often have a little suspicion. They may think, I evaluated a guy a few days ago, and he said to me, "Doctor, I'm not sure if I'm crazy, but, I'm wondering if I have something demonic." And, I could have talked to him and thought that I had mainly a psychiatric case. It turned out, he had a history of occultism. And he had a tremendous response to, there was a priest with me who tested him with the Eucharist, and he had a completely dramatic repulsion, horror when the Eucharist was put on him. So you do these tests in sometimes these cases that are trickier. Now, again, you and I are Christians. I understand that some psychiatric patients, like all of us, are subject to lesser demonic attacks, you might say, like temptation. Which patients are tempted to do something sinful or disordered, which patients are, just subject to, the weaknesses and the limitations of our fallen natures. It's hard to say, we don't know for sure. I haven't really had people come to me as patients. The vast majority of my patients, and remember, these people I'm assessing usually are not patients. I don't like go on to see them for, weeks and months afterwards. Those are more clear-cut people who already often suspect, well, doctor, there might be something overt demonic attack. Now, when I'm dealing with normal patients, and these are patients, sometimes I feel that they may be dealing with temptations or some, you might say, darkness in their soul that they do, have to think about and maybe even, seek spiritual assistance on. But I'm not a priest, I'm not an exorcist, so I don't treat them for that aspect of their problem. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, absolutely. Do priests ever ask you to attend the exorcism?
Well, they ask me all the time, and
Okay.
I have been to over 100 exorcisms. You got to remember, I've been doing this for 25, 30 years. So especially in the beginning, I wanted to see what happened in these exorcisms and, how effective the help was. I always keep a little bit of my skeptical side. But, I've been to enough exorcisms by this point to know what happens. Sometimes there are a lot of fireworks during the exorcisms. Sometimes they're not, and then the person is just, by the prayers delivered. Of course, they're not delivered by the priest. They're delivered by our Lord. No good exorcist, and this is all around the world, in my opinion, is going to say, well, I'm the person who delivered them. They're going to say, we said some formal prayers, united with the prayers of the church, and our Lord decided at that point to deliver this person. But it's always our Lord who does it. It's Jesus who does it. It's not the priest. Now, during the exorcisms, I've often seen when the demon often goes into a trance, I've often seen quite remarkable things. I mentioned that victims in a trance can start speaking foreign language, not because they know the language, but because the demon has surfaced. The demon is now speaking in the exorcism. I'll give you an example of a case I had in the Midwest where I attended that exorcism, and the woman went into a trance. She was unequivocally possessed. She went into a trance and she started speaking this vaguely Slavic language. I know a number of languages myself, including, Latin and French. I didn't know any Slavic language, but it seemed to me that it had a Slavic feel to it. And there were about 8 of us lay people, observing, or some of them were holding her down. And we were all a little mystified because, the demon was speaking in this foreign language. And after the end of the exorcism, which was not completely successful, but definitely was helpful, we asked the priest if he understood what was going on, why the demon was speaking this foreign language that none of us knew, and we were pretty sure the woman didn't know. She was not highly educated and she had never left her state. She certainly didn't have Bulgarian parents. Well, I'm giving the story away. The priest said to us, well, I was born in Bulgaria. So the demon was speaking Bulgarian to me. He was trying to, mock me and tell me to leave him alone. So, you see some of these even more dramatic signs during exorcisms. I have never seen this myself, even though I've been to over 100 exorcisms, but about 40 to 45 people have reported me in there, including clergy, but lay people as well, that during certain exorcisms of very severe cases, the person has levitated. And I believe that. I don't believe, 45 people are, lying to me. As a member, in good standing as a non-exorcist of the International Association of Exorcists, I often tell people, Mr. Sparks, look, I wrote a book about it. I report these stories. I don't supply the evidence, the evidence is out there, and God has allowed me to see some of the evidence. Readers and, other people, non-Christian people, or people who are Christian but skeptical of possessions, they have to decide for themselves, by the grace of God, they have to decide what they think about this. But they also don't have to believe, one person. I mean, look, I'm a professor of psychiatry. I'm not going to make up stories. But there are people who make up stories or exaggerate. I'm not one of them. Everything I say in a podcast, everything I say in my book is 100% accurate. I change the names of people, obviously, but aside from that, all these facts are correct. And I know that, a lot of people have read the book and they become convinced, if they were skeptical. I have a very good Jewish friend who's a physician, and he said to me, Rich, how come you didn't tell me about this sideline of yours? I said, well, I don't go around telling everybody in my personal life. I said, so what did you think? He said, I don't see how anybody can read that book and think that a very educated, scientifically trained person hasn't presented tremendous evidence for things like evil spirits and possessions. And I said to this friend of mine, I said, well, that's one of the reasons I wrote the book. But I also tell people, Mr. Sparks, I don't care, I don't care whether people believe me or not. That's up to them. Obviously I feel God is asking me to, speak publicly about this stuff, maybe to, educate people that, they may be suffering from psychiatric condition instead of a demonic attack, because, that's part of another reason I wrote the book. So, people don't go around exaggerating medical or psychiatric conditions as automatically demonic attacks. But the other thing I say is, there are plenty of people, in the Protestant world who have experience with deliverance. There are many people in the Catholic world. There are, several hundred priests, because most of the members are priests. There are several hundred exorcists in the International Society of Exorcists. They've all written books about this, too, or many of them have publicly spoken out, done podcasts, or written books. The former president, who's a guy named Famonte, he has several books on this subject. People may know Father Amorth was a famous Catholic exorcist. Other people like Gary Thomas, who trained in Rome out in California, has written about these stuffs. I know many American exorcists. I also know a number of psychiatrists. I'm not the only psychiatrist who does this work. I think I speak out more than other people, and I think I've probably seen more of these cases than most other doctors, obviously. I had a former chairman who was president of the American Psychiatric Association, a very prominent psychiatrist. He wrote the foreword to my book, and he said, Dr. Gallagher has seen more of these cases than any doctor in the world. I mean, he's told me even that I've probably seen more of these cases than any doctor, not exorcist, but doctor in history, because, people can come from all over the world to talk to me, or I can see them on Zoom, just as we're talking now. But again, in a way, I don't want people just to take my word for it. My word is good. I'm an honest person. I'm not going to lie about this stuff. I don't need the money. I don't make money in this field by and large. If people want to read the book and get a scientific understanding of this whole subject, great. But you can read plenty of other people's books too. I've worked at times with, Protestant ministers, even people of other faiths, occasionally rabbis and imams who, have some of these demonic cases as well. They often eventually send them to, Christian exorcists or deliverance people. And so there's a lot of people, out there in America and around the world who come from, Protestant background, Eastern Orthodox background, or Catholic background, and, they also have spoken out. I mean, because I'm a professor of psychiatry and trained very rigorously in medicine, psychiatry, and the scientific method, with some people, I suppose I have more credibility, but it doesn't mean that these books and podcasts that other people do are often quite, credible and well-informed.
Well, since continuing with what you're talking about there, there's a lot of podcasts and a lot of books, just like books, like you said, but there's a lot of hoaxers, at least in my opinion, and a lot of showmanship, and also money to be made through viewing, these exorcisms as, I'm just going to say, as a form of entertainment. What would be your opinion on, for a person that needs help and assistance, what do you think would be signs of, I'm just going to say, fraudsters be avoided? In other words, no, that's somebody I don't want to be around. What would be some signs for that?
Well, this may sound extreme to, some people who are in this field with good intentions. But what I tell people who I think have a genuine attack, I say, don't go to people who charge you money.
Mm.
I know in the Catholic Church, and even it's sort of implied in the Gospels, by the way, when Jesus sent his closest followers out to, help people cure illness and, drive away spirits, which are two different things. Curing an illness and driving out a spirit is two different things. These are spiritual attacks. They're not normal illnesses. Jesus and the apostles were very understanding of that. They knew the distinction. And Jesus said, something like, take no money for what you're doing. I know at least in the Catholic Church and the Orthodox churches, and I think a lot of Protestants ministers as well, they refuse to take money. So I'd say the biggest, and it is supposed to be a spiritual ministry. It's not supposed to be a way to get rich or anything. Now, I understand, some ministers, have to make a living. I'm not judging these people. I'm just saying those are the people that I tell people to avoid, because I want them to, it doesn't have to be Catholic, but I want them to seek out a spiritually educated, sensible person who sees this as a spiritual ministry. Now, obviously, there are other signs of hoaxsters and fraudsters. I don't have the impression that most people in this field are fraudsters and hoaxsters, but you're right, some of them are. Some of them who write books, including some lay people, I mean, I know for a fact they just make up stories or they exaggerate it to such an extent. But again, that doesn't mean, there's a phrase in Latin, abuse does not remove proper use. It's a Latin phrase that often gets quoted. That's true, just because there are abuses of exorcisms. I mean, there are some people involved in exorcisms who either don't know what they're doing or do dangerous things. And that's occurred throughout all history. People will physically beat the person when the demon is manifesting, or they will, do some kind of mumbo jumbo prayers or like a witch doctor or something. Those people, of course, all should be avoided. And there have been some tragic cases where, people have been harmed or even killed during exorcisms. I haven't seen that in the Catholic Church in all the years I've dealt with that, but I'm sure, most Protestant deliverance people and ministers are probably sincere people. But I do know in some of the more ignorant Christian communities, unfortunately, that can occur, that people can do very unwise or even dangerous things during exorcisms.
Fair enough. You've already mentioned there are a number of different books out there on exorcisms written by priests and lay people and other identities of clergy. But what I found unique about your book, Doctor, was chapter 6, which had many different terminologies that were dealing with your profession. To me, that was interesting to understand your involvement, your part that you perform as a physician, as a doctor, in that area of exorcism. And there's terminologies that you use in, I guess, the diagnosis of individuals such as, one would be common today, like narcissistic or antisocial. Abbreviations such as BID that you mentioned earlier briefly in this podcast. Also BPD, the borderline personality disorder, and terms like comorbid. Some of these, if not all of them, were actually mentioned in chapter 6, which I feel is very important because it's not just the book on the exorcism, that's also a book on how to determine through your profession whether somebody should go on to that because they'd be exercised by a priest. Can you give us a case in a study where you use a term like antisocial or DID, which was what multiple personalities? How would that appear? Like if somebody came or a priest brought somebody to your office, all right, how do you determine this is BID or even more complex? Like you say is comorbid, there might be two types of illnesses going on at once. That would be my question. But chapter 6 to me was important because it kind of pointed towards your profession in this involvement of the exorcism process, if you would.
Well, yeah, a good question. Often complicated answer. I mean, I'm a professor of psychiatry. I teach at a couple of medical schools, and I've been seeing patients, as part of my job. I'm a very experienced clinician for many years now. I mean, I'm pretty experienced at diagnosing, medical and sometimes medical, but also mental disorders. So I know what the criteria are, and I know how to diagnose someone with antisocial personality or dissociative identity disorder or some type of psychotic condition. Three good examples of diagnoses that are sometimes mistaken by people who are not aware of these conditions, how often these people may be delusional or simply mistaken about thinking they are demonically attacked. I mean, antisocial personality, which is really synonymous with someone who's sociopathic or even criminal. We often use the phrase about somebody who's evil, right? We say, well, what possessed that person? But people can be evil without being possessed. And now that person, to the extent that they're evil and sinful, doing violent things or doing, horrendously tragic things to other people, of course they need spiritual help, I mean, often they need a conversion, let alone, learn how to pray and turn to Christ. So I'm not saying that some of these conditions, antisocial personality would be perhaps the prime one. They do need spiritual help of some sort, but it's more kind of, normal spiritual help, advice. So I'm not sending those people to exorcists. Multiple personality, you get some people who are so confused or they're in dissociated states and, they may even have some weird, what's called alters or personalities, where they think they're being attacked by something evil or they have an evil side of themselves. I mean, normally that's a psychological disorder. A lot of those people have been abused. A lot of those people are very confused, some even delusional about their condition. They need primarily psychological and, sometimes psychiatric and psychological help. But, they're not going around, going into, well, they can go into trances. That's why people get confused. But they're not going around in trances having, immense hostility to anything religious or, speaking foreign languages or being aware of, things that they would have no way of knowing. I mean, a Satanist woman that I dealt with who had a possession, she would go into trances. I would witness those trances, but she also levitated during an exorcism, which I didn't see. But she very clearly had occult knowledge. I mean, she knew how my mother had died years earlier, but she knew all kinds of things like that. In fact, she claimed, and I tested her once, that she could see a particular priest involved at a distance. And I called the priest and I said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Who wants to know?" And I said, he was a friend of mine. And I said, well, this Satanist woman claims to describe what you're doing to a T. She knew what he was wearing. She knew that he was at an unusual place. He was at a beach. I mean, she'd have no way of knowing all this stuff unless she was fed that information by Satan. And during the trances, she did all kinds of things like, make hostile comments, during the exorcism, speak foreign languages. So, this is very, very different than multiple personality disorder. They don't have all these, they go into a trance, but they don't have all these, weird diabolic symptoms. So once again, I'm emphasizing to you, Mr. Sparks, you always have to take the total package. What was going on in this person's life? Is there something that likely made them, want to be attacked by demons, or demons would want to attack them, or felt they had the right to attack them? And if there are all these, weird signs and hostility towards religion at times, and for want of a better word, what's often called paranormal phenomena, well, then you know you're dealing with something beyond a psychiatric case. But when you first evaluate the patient, of course, you have to make sure that this is not primarily a psychiatric problem or a medical problem like epilepsy. Does that answer your question?
Yes, sir. Yes, doctor. I appreciate it. This is my last question, and then we can go on with something that you find relevant and for the listening audience. My last one has to do, I was raised Lutheran, and when I went to school, I went to a private school, and there is Methodist. And let's say that I felt oppressed or sad, or maybe even a depression. I could say in the Lutheran belief and also Methodist, they'd first send me to a doctor without a question. Without a question. However, when I was younger, and let's say I was in my 20s, I was invited to, and I don't mean to embarrass any denomination, it's just my personal experience. When I went to the Pentecostal churches, everything was spiritual. Everything was spiritual. And I would see the same people, sadly to me, that had certain types of ailments that they would complain about in prayer line again and again and again. And then if that didn't work, they would go to another church that's full gospel, because you got to be full gospel, and again and again and again. And then there might be some big televangelist coming into town, and then they go over there to stand in the prayer line. And I've known these people in some cases doing this for years. And I think how sad if it was something like, I don't want to say if it was a medical condition that could have been treated and dealt with, rather than going through the same routine. How would one, if somebody has a friend that's going through that, how could they reach out to somebody that I've seen personally? How could somebody reach out to an individual going through that and try to reason with them to get some help, to an alternative type of help?
Well, there are, just as there are, bad lawyers and bad doctors, there are all kinds of varied quality of ministers and denominations. Like you, I'm not gonna, criticize any particular denomination or variety of Christian. But, people should use their good judgment and their common sense. As again, they shouldn't be put on display, in my opinion. They also shouldn't, pay anybody to, deliver them or do an exorcism. But they should seek out someone who seems to be, sensible, sober person who has experience in this field. So they should consult a knowledgeable clergy person who's not going to just, assume every problem the person has, requires deliverance. Now, again, for some people, that can be easier said than done.
Right.
They may well consult a doctor. There are, I'm not the only doctor in the world who does this. There are Christian doctors and Catholic doctors who probably could be consulted and at least ask for their opinion, so that if it's just sort of depression, they probably should be getting, medical and psychological help. I mean, every case is a little bit different, but, this is the complexity of our existence on this earth. There's a lot of ignorance. There's a lot of abuse. I mean, Catholic priests, some of them, a few of them, and other clergy have even been accused of abuse. So, not every clergy of all denominations are knowledgeable, holy people. You want to try to find someone who's sensible, holy, and knowledgeable. I don't say that's a piece of cake, but I think if people, seek them out long enough and pray about it, and maybe find a doctor who can also help them, sort out what's going on with them. That's the more sensible course. I mean, you mentioned Lutheran. I know there are Lutheran exorcists. They often, the Lutheran Church, in its formal varieties, often does, like the Catholic Church, require people get medical evaluations. So you try to choose, the people that you think our Lord has, allowed you to encounter and meet. Easier said than done sometimes, admittedly.
Right. So at this time, I'm finished with my questions, Doctor. Do you have anything you'd like to add that our listening audience should be aware of?
Well, I'll make a couple of scientific points and his historical points. I was a student of the classics in Princeton, and I loved history. And one of the things that struck me was that throughout all of history, not necessarily in, demons the way Christians understand it, but pretty much all societies, all cultures in history have believed in evil spirits and good spirits too. And there's evidence in almost all cultures that there were always people who, were possessed. I mean, there was a famous German historian, psychologist who wrote a famous book about possessions. He was not a believer, but his name was Professor Osterreich. And he, about 100 years ago, he documented hundreds, even thousands of cases all around the world throughout history. My book was recently translated into Japanese, and I remember speaking to some Japanese people and saying, well, is this something the Japanese public would be interested in? And, my publisher, and they all said to me, Japan, I mean, there are some Christians in Japan, but not many, basically a pagan country, and, which has their indigenous beliefs. And they said, oh, almost everybody in Japan believes in evil spirits. So, people sometimes say to me, Mr. Sparks, how does it feel to be out of the mainstream? And I say to them, what mainstream are you talking about? Most Americans believe in evil spirits. Most people in the world today, maybe not in certain, more skeptical countries like in Europe, but most people in the world today believe in evil spirits. And the vast majority of people throughout history have been believers in evil spirits, with different theories about where they think these theories came from. It really was the Jewish thinkers, even pre-Christ, who, used the word demons, which is a translation of a Greek word, which was a broader term in Greek. I studied ancient Greek for about 10 years. And, they kind of figured it out in complicated ways that the pagan gods and goddesses were often essentially evil spirits, and they also figured out that evil spirits were fallen angels. And, so the belief in possession at the time of Christ and even in fallen angels, not all Jewish citizens in Palestine believed that, but a great deal did. And so, when Jesus started exorcising, the people he encountered who were possessed, I mean, it had a tremendous, tremendous impact on the world in the Jewish world. And then when the Christian missionaries went out and also had a lot of success with people that the pagan priests couldn't deal with because they were beyond their power, you can imagine that, that was one of the reasons Christianity eventually spread and sort of, became the predominant religion in the Greco-Roman world, in the Roman Empire. So, it pays, what I'm saying is, it pays to know a little bit about history before people regard these beliefs as odd. They have not been odd beliefs in history. And, thankfully, the church over the centuries, occasionally making mistakes, I'm sure, but the church over the centuries has, learned how to deal with these cases. So when people say, Dr. Gallagher, you're out of the mainstream, I say, what mainstream are you talking about? Not the mainstream that I know in America. Although admittedly, a lot of doctors, especially psychiatrists, for reasons we've gone into, are more skeptical than the average American. The only other thing I'd like to emphasize is, deliverance and exorcism prayers and services, ministry, if you want to call it that. It's not magic, Exorcists are not magic, witch doctors. You say the mumbo jumbo prayer and it's all fixed. That doesn't work that way. Protestant and, Christian and Orthodox people involved in this ministry, generally, if they know what they're doing, it's also a pastoral ministry. In other words, they have to educate the victim. They have to do a good discernment sometimes with medical help, but they have to educate the victim that a lot of the work is the work of the victim. They have to, turn to Christ. They have to pray about it. Because by and large, if a person doesn't turn to God, a healthy spirituality, or pray, it's almost impossible for them to be delivered. So I'm not saying the deliverance prayers and the exorcisms are not helpful. They're very helpful. They can be very helpful. Even so, that's by the power of Christ. It's not by the power of the minister or exorcist. So that can be very, very helpful. But it doesn't mean that people can just not change their ways if it's been sinful or evil or occultic. I mean, they have to give up the occult. The Satanist woman I mentioned, unfortunately, she was not a stupid woman, but she was a little dense about this whole subject. She wanted a magic exorcism. And I and the priest told her that that's not what happens. We'll do some exorcisms to weaken the power of the evil spirits, but you got to work at it. You certainly have to leave the satanic cult. You can't go around worshiping Satan and expect that you're going to be delivered by our Lord. It doesn't work that way. And sadly, tragically, she never fully agreed to that, so she was never delivered. But I had another guy I worked with who was a gangster, had turned to one of these Mexican satanic cults. Eventually found himself possessed, turned back to the church. He was baptized a Catholic. And eventually, even though he was, for a while, he was not only a satanic cultist, but he did some pretty evil things. He was eventually delivered because he worked at it. So people have to understand there's a pastoral component. People need to be advised. They need to be advised how to pray sometimes. They need to be advised to turn back to Christ. And if they don't do that, I mean, that's just as important or sometimes even more important than any kind of exorcism or deliverance prayers. So, one has to beware of people who make promises, or sometimes the Hollywood version of this. It's a complicated process. It requires spiritual growth because without that, our Lord is kind of waiting for that person to turn to Him. He doesn't force Himself on people unless they're making efforts to turn to belief in Him and His Father.
All right. Doctor, has been a really interesting podcast and very informative. I learned a lot, and I appreciate all your time and your effort that you put into it. Folks, today I've been talking to Dr. Gallagher, and his book is Demonic Foes. I do recommend it. I purchased the book, and also I got Audible, so there's no excuse out there. Don't give me this, well, I don't have time to read. Do what I did. Just plug it in your car and go down the road and listen to it. I recommend it. It's not a satanic panic book. There's a lot of good information in there. Doctor, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Let me just say thank you for a well done interview. Applaud your work in archaeology in service of looking at some biblical historical data. My book is easily available on Amazon, for instance, and other places. It's up to the reader to decide. I don't hawk my books on these podcasts. I do ask your audience, at the risk of anyway sounding overly pious or something, but if you listen to this and you want to pray for the work I do, we all need to pray for each other as Christians. And I suppose, I think that I need a little protection from the forces that indirectly, I'm not an exorcist I'm dealing with, so I don't turn down the prayers of anyone in your audience who's inclined to say them for me and my work.
All right.
And thank you, as I said, for a very nice interview. Okay.
I really appreciate your time. Once again, you 280,000 people out there, get on that prayer list. Let's go, folks. And the book, Dynamic Foes. Until next time. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Doctor.
Can you hear me now? You see me, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, we're getting some kind of interference. Mr. Sparks, I'm a professor at a medical school. I'm not superstitious, okay?
Right.
This may well be demonic interference. I was on a Midwest studio program a few months ago, and the woman host calls me in a panic, and she says, "Dr. Gallagher, we've never had so much electronic interference in our studio as this morning." Now, eventually we got it to work, but so far we're not getting this to work. You believe me when I say this could be demonic interference?
Yeah. Yeah. I hope not.
Well, it would be a temporary thing. I mean, it's what we call demonic harassment.
Very possible.
It's very possible. You don't have an IT guy with
A what?
you.
You don't have an
IT,
techie guy with you.
techie
No,
guy
I
with
don't.
you. I don't really know what to say. I mean, I'm happy to reschedule it. There is definitely some type of interference. Even that phone call is a little bizarre.
Yeah.
See what I mean?
Never heard anything like this before.
Well, when I do some of these, I'm not saying this happens a lot, but
Yes.
when I do some of these shows on podcast on the demonic, this can happen. They don't want to. The evil spirits don't want us to talk. I mean, look. I mean, there could be some technical problem I'm just not aware of, but I don't think it's from my end.
Yeah, this is odd because usually this doesn't happen at all.
Yeah, no,
And I
This
shut
is-
down and I started again. So usually that would remedy.
this
And
is
everything's-
this is an unusual topic.
Yeah, usually we're on archaeology.
You're an archaeologist, right?
Yes.
That's great. A very interesting profession. And I know there's even more of a ferment these days about archaeology and the Bible. Complicated field, but interesting, at least to me. I mean, again, this sounds almost superstition.
Yes.
Can you hear me? No?
Yes. Let me turn the phone off.
Yeah, but that's the phone.
No.
Okay, so that's the phone.
Okay, so I'm gonna hang up the phone. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
No, you're not hearing me. Oh, you can't hear me?
Yes.
All right, so something happened. We may never know the explanation, but I have a pretty good guess.
Well,
You can tell
persistence.
your audience. You can tell, well, I said a prayer. I don't know if you did. You can tell your audience that if you want. It's up to you.
Okay.
Thank you for listening to the Stones That Speak Biblical Archaeology podcast. All our archaeology books can be found at our ECM website and available on Amazon. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more informative episodes. Visit us at Stones That Speak, blogspot.com, and on YouTube for additional content. Thanks for watching.